Today, at least in the day of winter of 2022, we've seen some dramatic changes in our world as a result of the COVID-19 virus and the related pandemic. Businesses have become open to staff working from home. Employees now welcome options to telecommute to work. Schools have begun to explore and recognize the need for distance education. Even churches have become open to exploration, perhaps more now than ever before, exploring ways of sharing worship, learning through the internet, gathering online for regular services and small group learning, and building of communities. How has the church managed to transition from what was, for many, a communal gathering of people in the presence of others to one of distance? Some worship services do need to go beyond the singing of hymns, the sharing of prayers, the hearing of the message of God proclaimed. One particular form of worship that comes to mind depends on a number of physical things, a requirement that is seemingly impossible to deliver through the internet. How does online worship happen? Well, we need more than digital bits and bytes. Let's talk about communion. Communion is one of two sacraments that are celebrated in the United Church of Canada, along with baptism. The forms of these sacraments come from the work of union in 1925, when the many Protestant denominations in Canada joined to form the United Church. Starting with a somewhat diverse collection of ways in which to celebrate communion, each familiar to a subset of what became a part of the United Church of Canada, the outcome was an agreed upon set of forms. Today we celebrate open communion, which allows both members and non-members to participate, practiced with the United Church of Canada in the way of inclusivity. This very openness to all who wish to share in the celebration of communion meal has led to changes in the way communion is actually shared. We find in most churches that a replacing of the traditional wine and substituting grape juice has come to be. This is in order to not exclude those who might not be able to or choose not to consume alcohol. It's one of the many ways that might seem small, but are yet nonetheless important as the church examines and changes how it celebrates communion and other things throughout the life of the church work. Within Christendom, there's many varied beliefs about what the sacrament of communion means. For example, some believe that through transubstantiation, or in another similar manner, the elements are changed through the process of the service, endowed with the presence of God, becoming more than simply bread and wine, changed, transformed into something more. In the United Church, however, we celebrate communion in, as the manual says, thankful remembrance, which is to say that we believe that communion is a memorialism, an important remembrance of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ made for all of humankind. While we might not believe that the elements of communion are physically or spiritually transformed, changed, we do believe that they take on a change of meaning. From simply being bread and wine, they now become symbols of the body of Christ broken for us, the blood of Christ spilled for us. As I noted, the beliefs and practices of the United Church are both historically rooted in the amalgamation of many different forms. The ecumenical mission of the Church, however, opens the door and invites exploration and continued learning that comes from sharing and experiencing what is practiced in other denominations. Regardless of what those forms might be, communion continues to have an importance for us, an importance in the linking of the visible and the invisible, of the physical and the spiritual realms. And these are primary sources of influence that adapt and shape our experience of communion, and they define the appropriateness or the viability of a specific form or manner in which we might share. Do this in remembrance of me. What is it that Jesus means when he says this? Is it the eating of bread and wine? Is it the celebrating of the traditional Passover meal? Perhaps it's the new tradition of communion as we've come to know it. Is it perhaps the gathering of people who come to remember Christ? To be honest, it's not really possible to fully understand what Christ meant in saying this. In the scriptures, we find a depiction of the Last Supper found in the Gospels and other places, and we see a set of common things. There's one who presides. In the case of the Last Supper, it's Jesus. There's bread, there's wine, there's blessings. Finally, there's those who gather to share in the meal. Of these many things, which are required? Are any of these things optional? Can we leave something out and still have communion? Take, for example, the gathering of the group of disciples. Do we need a gathering of many to celebrate communion? If so, how many do we need? This particular question might be important as we explore communion online. Looking at the scriptures, searching for information, we need to be aware of the manifold meanings which are possible within the text. Written by human hands but inspired by God, the possibility of endless varieties of meaning exists. Dr. Robert Fennell, in his book, The Rule of Faith, explores some of the ways in which we might interpret the scriptures. But one theme that arises throughout, however, is that there's no one correct interpretation. And depending on the circumstances of experience of tradition, the interpretation of one particular passage might change. One might look at the scriptures using the Wesleyan quadrilateral in order to find some insights. The Last Supper is described in great detail. It's found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and in various places through the writings of the Apostle Paul. Well, Scripture holds primary authority in interpretation. Tradition and reason and experience are also used to help explain what is found within the text. For many, tradition brings a communion service that is celebrated in the community of others who share the elements that are blessed, listen to the acts of Jesus proclaimed, and finally, share in the meal, consuming the elements. But reason and experience provide us with an opportunity to possibly reimagine communion, one that takes place when we are not gathered in one physical location. If we are constrained to gathering through the internets, can our experiences and our reason envision a sharing of communion through that place? What communion is, what the discrete components are, presents important questions that need to be asked, because by its very nature, online communion will not and cannot be experienced in the same way that our traditional in-sanctuary services will. Sometime even before the pandemic began, communities of faith were exploring how the internet might play a role in the functioning of their church. In April 2020, the United Church of Canada released a document in response to the needs of worship services online, which were more and more frequently being shared through the internets. The overall message of this document is that while communion, as we find in tradition, is the preferred way in which to celebrate the sacraments, the pastoral and spiritual needs of the people who come to worship, to build a relationship with God, are a little bit more important than what we find historically. Within this document, although we do find an acceptance of communion shared through online usage, there's some important things to note, two in particular. First, is that while it's accepted as a valid form of communion when shared online, it's strongly preferred to celebrate communion in the physical presence of others. The second, which for some might seem somewhat short-sighted, is that online communion must take the form of a live stream service, which is to say that it must not be pre-recorded. It must occur for all who gather at the exact same time. Why might this particular restriction be a factor in the validity of communion online? Perhaps the biggest question on many minds who are pondering what online communion means is in regards to the physical elements, the bread and the wine. Barring some science fiction inspired transferring of matter through the internets, it's impossible to have these two components of communion shared. If we are to celebrate communion online through the internets, we must therefore either eliminate the need for these physical items or to use items that are local to each participant. Aldrich Swingley described the elements of communion as physically ordinary, that there's no transformation taking place, but that those items do obtain special symbolic significance during the sacraments. No longer simply a loaf of bread or a cup of grape juice that we might find at any grocery store. They become important symbols of Christ's expression of love for all of us. And from this theological reasoning, there's no need for the elements to be physically present at the presider. There is no transformation of the physical or spiritual matter. There's simply the creation of symbolism in these elements. Obviously, this is a simplification of the sacrament and the liturgical processes which they are part of. But this reasoning seems to be appealed to by the April 2020 documents. Beyond the physical elements, the sharing of prayers, response of the participants, the presence of the presider who delivers the liturgy, and those who gather to celebrate and to remember. All of these are important parts of the sacraments. Agreement has been found that when using specific forms of technology and proper preparation, that all of these aspects of the sacrament can be satisfied in the celebrating of communion through the internets. Further supporting these changes or divergences from most common forms of communion that tradition might bring us, there's some less commonly shared forms that retain authority and appropriateness that still come as a part of the church and yet might find some of these changes present. The description of the communion found in the scriptures lists memorial acclamation, prayer and blessing of the elements, which are a wine and a bread, and sharing a communion of those. Our tradition shows that many of these same key points, and yet we do find some noticeable discrepancies here. Most congregations, as we already said, have replaced the wine of the Last Supper with unfermented grape juice, which is a more fitting means of open and inclusive sharing of the sacraments. Jesus and the disciples joined that night to celebrate the traditional Passover meal. And tradition would see matzah, a form of unleavened breads, on the table. Although we commonly find gluten-free bread as part of our elements in the church now, it's rare to find bread which is unleavened. Most congregations enjoy the fluffy white bread risen with yeast, and that just wouldn't be part of tradition. Even the gathering of people doesn't always seem to be a requirement. Two common and accepted expressions of the sacrament that might change this are those which take place in the home and those which take place in hospitals or bedsides, as one comes to the ends of their time here on earth. While there may be some gathering of people, it wouldn't be all too uncommon to find only a single participant. Zwingli described the sacraments, in addition to their symbolism, as a sign and public demonstration of our commitment to the church and those who make up the church. However, this doesn't always seem to be a requirement. But this factor does lead to specific requirements for sharing the communion sacrament through the internet. Reading the April 2020 documents, there's a word in there, live streams. And it's used to describe the form of accepted transmission or delivery of communion services online. Some might find this word and assume that it simply means any of the number of ways in which video is delivered through the internet. But a more precise understanding of the word leads to one that is synchronous, a celebration that is shared at the same time for all who participates, as opposed to pre-recorded or viewing a service that took place earlier in the day, earlier in the week, or some other time. I've been led to believe that there was some concern that pre-recorded communion services would lead to the celebration becoming something other than communion, or something less than communion. But this requirement of live streaming was seen as remedying those concerns. We've seen a number of deviations from tradition in these celebrations of communion, all of them fully accepted as leading to a valid communion service and accepted by the church. A new deviation, that of the presence of the presider, however, is one new factor which internet communion entails. Is there a difference in how service is presided over, when the presider isn't physically there? One particular form of communion that might help us to understand how the minister, the presider of communion, might not need to be physically present, that of in-home services. I've spoken to a number of ministers in regards to in-home communion, and these ministers all agreed that in-home communion was not only accepted, but particularly important for the pastoral care of those that they serve. They suggested that elements for these home services might be prepared and present during the sacrament service in the church. In this way, they are presided over in the community of others. When time comes for the in-home service, these already prepared elements are brought along, and while the presider of the service and the minister who visits the home might be the same person, the act of presiding happened earlier during the main service. So, in this way, the presider, even though it's the same person, wasn't really present in the home when communion was served. And that's kind of how online services are for communion. The presider is not really there. While I can't find any official teachings or publications of the United Church that support or detail this way of bringing communion to the home, some congregations do provide this as a way of celebrating in home when unable to visit the church, and there's some precedents. Other denominations will expectedly have their own particular traditions and practices in regards to the celebration of communion. And those practices will have no direct impact on how the United Church of Canada views the sacraments, but comparing how they differ might provide some further insights. The Church of England has observed communion online as a spiritual communion, which does not require the physical elements. The Episcopal Church concluded that online communion is not valid as an expression of the sacraments. The Methodist Church published a document which instructs, similar to the United Church, that only live stream services are appropriate. The Anglican Church of Canada has completed some significant study of Eucharistic practices, even before the time of pandemic. And in 2015 published a document which indicates the validity of communion online. While it shows a preference for live stream services, there appears to be no absolute requirements for this to be the case. While the survey of other denominations and practices is by no means extensive, it does display a wide range of practices currently in use, and that the current accepted practices of the United Church of Canada have good theological reasoning which meets with others. Welcome to the future. And what does the future hold for online communion in the United Church of Canada? For now, all of the requirements and authority for online communion in the United Church of Canada are contained within that April 2020 documents. Currently, there is an active sacraments task group which has been asked to investigate how the United Church of Canada views and celebrates communion online. Unfortunately, as of now, no final report has been delivered. Will there be any changes in how live versus pre-recorded services are viewed? I suspect that it's unlikely that this decision will be changed, especially as the theological reasoning is consistent with other Christian denominations. very few appear to place the same value in pre-recorded services as those that are live. That said, I would appreciate learning exactly what aspect of pre-recorded communion service is that's not in line with the doctrine and the theology of the United Church of Canada, especially when compared to other accepted expressions of the sacrament. As of now, the live requirement presents for some congregations something of a barrier to celebrating the sacraments. Congregations serving people in rural areas may not have the technological capabilities to live stream their services. They might rely on pre-recording of those services due to limitations of bandwidth or internet connectivity. There's also a question of the pastoral care and the accessibility for these services. There's some who aren't able to participate in the service when it's live, but would otherwise be able to join and participate at a later point, something that's provided with a pre-recorded service. The future of worship in the church brings with it many questions, and for better or worse, many changes from the tradition of old. Only the passage of time will reveal where we are destined, but always, God will lead us to where we are called to be and to serve those we are called to serve. Thank you, and have a great day.